the next step is to add a little bit of heat shrink to the insulation where we cut so that there's no water ingress. So you have to bundle all of the wires together, all of those copper wire ends, and work the heat shrink just back until it's just barely covering the white insulation, the original insulation on the wire. We find a 2-inch piece of heat shrink is the best application here, and if you overlap the white insulation by an inch or so, that should be enough to make sure there's no water penetration in that cable. Once the heat shrink has been worked over the folded white insulation, we're going to add the eyelet. And since your cables are already bundled due to the heat shrink, it should be relatively easy to get that eyelet on the cable end and under the heat shrink. The eyelet that we're using is a 3/8 terminal eye size with an 8-gauge wire inlet. Your crimping tool may differ, but just make sure that it has a 10mm spot to crimp this eyelet. This is a 10mm slot on this crimper right here. When you crimp the eyelet, make sure the pyramid side is on the bottom of the eyelet. Make sure you add a fair amount of pressure to crimp that eyelet. Then, if the heat shrink needs to be worked back up, just make sure that it's worked to the very end of the wire on the eyelet so that we have good coverage for the heat shrink on both sides. So once we have the heat shrink shrunk, we're going to add our label tag so that we can once again understand what cable this is that we're hooking back up. Since we made a handy dandy note on the cable previously, we should have no problem identifying this cable. This is the T5. Next, we will repeat the exact same process for the other cable in this bundle, the T8 cable. We're cutting right at the mark that we made with the Sharpie. And again, you're going to need a heavy-duty set of cutters because this is a thick set of wires. Next, we will make 2 slits in the insulation about 1.5 inches down the existing set of wires. We will cut that insulation away, revealing about 1.5 inches of copper wires. And again, you'll remember that we have a special coating on each one of these wires. This is where we burn the coating and reveal fresh copper underneath. So, once again, we will do this process. It may seem tedious, but it is absolutely necessary. So now our second set of wires has been flamed and scrubbed, and we are removing the tips. Once again, be sure to place your finger over the tips and remove them as a unit. Next, we will apply our heat shrink. We're just gathering all of the wires in a tight little bundle and working the heat shrink down again until about 1 inch of it covers the white insulation. Once the heat shrink is appropriately placed, we'll add the eyelet just as before. Next, we will crimp the eyelet. Make sure the pyramid side again is on the bottom and crimp. Once our wire is crimped, you can apply heat to the heat shrink once it is placed appropriately. Again, we want the top side of the heat shrink to be all the way up against the eyelet so that we can make sure there's no water getting inside of that connection. Be sure to add the appropriate label to this cable, which is the T8 cable. And now both cables have been trimmed and re-eyed so that we can mount them up using our bracket. But before we do that, we're going to need to apply some looming to the set of wires in order to just keep them in a nice tight bundle. So depending on what number mower this service needs to be performed on, prior to mower 20, you may not find looming inside of this generator box. After mower 20, chances are you'll have looming that was installed from the Firefly factory. But if you have one of the older mowers, then you'll have to add looming to the entire bundle.